Picture this. It's the year 793 AD. The morning mist clings to the Northumbrian coast as monks at Lindisfarne Abbey begin their daily prayers. Suddenly, the horizon erupts with dragon-headed ships, their red and white sails cutting through the grey dawn like harbingers of a new age. But here is what most people don't realize. The Viking Age wasn't just about pillaging and plundering. It was an era of unprecedented exploration, innovation, and cultural exchange that stretched from the frozen fjords of Norway to the sun-baked shores of Constantinople, from the windswept plains of Russia to the mysterious lands of North America. 500 years before Columbus ever set sail, their gods walked among them in their stories. Their heroes battled giants. Scandinavia in the 8th century was a land of dramatic contrasts: towering mountains plunging into deep fjords, endless forests broken by crystalline lakes. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire had created a power vacuum across Europe, while climate change during the medieval warm period made long-distance sea travel more feasible. The longship was a masterpiece of engineering that combined speed, shallow draft, and remarkable seaworthiness. These vessels could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, allowing Vikings to strike deep into the heart of Europe. The ships were clinker-built with overlapping planks that gave them flexibility in rough seas, and their shallow keels meant they could be beached on any shoreline. Population growth in Scandinavia meant that land for farming was becoming scarce, pushing younger sons to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Within decades, Viking fleets were sailing up rivers across Europe: the Seine to Paris, the Thames to London, the Dnieper to Kiev. They established bases on islands like Noirmoutier off the French coast and the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea, creating permanent footholds for further expansion, and a coastline so complex and intricate that it seemed designed by the gods themselves for seafaring. They could switch seamlessly between raiding and trading, often in the same expedition. They learned local languages, adopted useful technologies, and were surprisingly tolerant of other religions when it served their purposes. This flexibility would serve them well as they spread across the known world and beyond. At the top were the Jarls, the noble class who owned large estates and commanded loyalty through gift-giving and military leadership. Below them were the Carls, free farmers who formed the backbone of society, and at the bottom were the thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into servitude. This hierarchical system created both the motivation for raiding younger sons of Carls seeking to elevate their status and the manpower to crew the longships. The harsh climate and challenging terrain forged a people who were tough, resourceful, and intimately connected to the sea. Their gods were warriors and wanderers themselves, and the concept of Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where brave warriors would feast until Ragnarok, made death in battle a glorious prospect rather than something to be feared. Odin, the All-Father, was himself a traveler and seeker of knowledge, embodying the Viking spirit of exploration and adventure. The Skulldalev ships, deliberately sunk in the fjord around 1070 AD to block enemy vessels, show us 5 different types of Viking vessels, from small fishing boats to massive warships capable of carrying 70 warriors. The largest Skulldalev II was over 30 meters long and built from Irish oak, suggesting the international nature of Viking shipbuilding even in their later period. And dragons, and their destiny was written in the stars by the Norns, the 3 sisters who controlled fate itself. This is the story of the Vikings not just as warriors, but as a civilization that dared to dream beyond the horizon, and whose legacy continues to capture our imagination more than 1,000 years later. These weren't just raiders, they were the Vikings, and they were about to change the world forever. They were master shipbuilders, fearless explorers, skilled craftsmen, shrewd traders, and keepers of some of the most captivating mythology the world has ever known. They established the first European settlement in North America, founded cities that still thrive today like Dublin and York, created trade networks that spanned continents, and developed a democratic system that influenced modern governance. For over 3 centuries, from roughly 793 to 1066 AD, the Vikings dominated the seas and shaped the destiny of Europe. The word Viking itself comes from the Old Norse Vikingur, meaning pirate or raider, but these remarkable people were so much more. But perhaps most fascinating of all, they lived in a world where the line between reality and myth was beautifully blurred. To understand the Vikings, we must first understand their homeland. The Viking Age didn't begin in a vacuum. By the 8th century, Scandinavian society had been evolving for centuries. But the real catalyst for the Viking expansion was their revolutionary shipbuilding technology. Archaeological evidence from sites like Roskilde in Denmark reveals the sophistication of Viking shipbuilding. The social structure that produced the Vikings was equally complex. Religion played a crucial role in Viking expansion. The first recorded Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 sent shockwaves through Christian Europe, but it was just the beginning. What made the Vikings so successful wasn't just their ships or their fighting prowess, it was their adaptability. The Viking expansion was not a single coordinated movement but rather a series of migrations, raids, and explorations that unfolded over 3 centuries. Each region of Scandinavia produced its own distinctive patterns of expansion, creating a complex web of Viking influence across Europe and beyond. The Danes primarily looked south and west, targeting the rich monasteries and trading centers of England and France. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 AD wasn't just a raiding force, it was a migration army intent on conquest and settlement. They colonized the Shetland and Orkney Islands, transforming them into stepping stones for further expansion. From there, they reached the Faroe Islands around 825 AD and Iceland by 874 AD. Around 985 AD, Eric the Red established the first European settlement in Greenland, creating 2 colonies that would persist for nearly 500 years. The Greenland settlements were remarkable for their adaptation to one of the world's most challenging environments. The Vikings learned to hunt seals and walruses, developed new architectural techniques for building in permafrost, and maintained trade connections with Europe despite the vast distances involved. Swedish Vikings served as merchants and mercenaries, trading amber, furs, and slaves for silver, silk, and spices from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Hordes of Arabic silver coins found throughout Scandinavia testify to the wealth generated by this eastern trade. In Normandy, Vikings who settled there became the Normans, who would later conquer England in 1066, bringing the Viking Age full circle. Within the span of 3 centuries, Vikings had established settlements. From Greenland to Ukraine, from the Faroe Islands to Sicily. They had sailed up rivers into the heart of continents and across oceans to unknown lands. No other medieval civilization achieved such geographical reach or had such a transformative impact on so many different cultures. In Sicily, Norman Vikings established one of the most cosmopolitan and tolerant kingdoms in medieval Europe. The settlement of Iceland represents one of the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age. Within 60 years, this previously uninhabited island had a population of around 60,000 people. Around 1000 AD, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland and established a settlement at what we now know as Landsaux Meadows in Newfoundland. These Norsemen, known as the Russ, established a trade route from the Baltic to Constantinople that became one of the most important commercial arteries of the medieval world. They founded cities like Novgorod and Kiev, and their leaders became the ruling class of what would eventually become Russia. The very name Russia derives from Rus. This makes the Vikings the first Europeans to reach the Americas, 5 centuries before Columbus. Led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, they carved out the Danelaw, a vast territory covering much of northern and eastern England where Danish law and customs prevailed for centuries. The Danish impact on England was profound and lasting. They established major trading centers like Jorvik York, which became one of the largest cities in medieval Europe, where free men gathered annually to make laws and settle disputes. These warriors were so valued for their loyalty and fighting ability that the position became hereditary among certain Scandinavian families. This tradition of democratic governance would later influence the development of parliamentary systems across northern Europe. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate in York have revealed a thriving commercial district where Viking craftsmen produced everything from jewelry to shoes. The Vikings introduced new words into the English language. Over 600 words in modern English derive from Old Norse, including basic terms like sky, knife, husband, and they. Norwegian Vikings, meanwhile, were drawn to the Atlantic. Iceland became a unique experiment in medieval democracy. The Althing, established in 930 AD, was one of the world's first parliaments. But the Norwegian expansion didn't stop with Iceland. Then came perhaps the most extraordinary Viking achievement of all, the discovery of North America. The Swedish Vikings chose a different path entirely, heading east across the Baltic Sea into the vast river systems of Eastern Europe. The eastern expansion was primarily commercial, rather than military. Perhaps most remarkably, some Vikings traveled as far as Constantinople, where they served as the Varangian Guard, the elite bodyguard unit of the Byzantine Emperor. The Viking expansion also had a profound impact on the regions they conquered and settled. What's remarkable about the Viking expansion is its sheer scale and diversity. To truly understand the Vikings, we must enter their spiritual world, a realm where gods and giants battled for supremacy, where magic was real, and where the fate of all existence hung in the balance. Norse mythology wasn't just entertainment for the Vikings. It was a living belief system that shaped their values, their behavior, and their understanding of their place in the cosmos. At the center of the Norse pantheon stood Odin, the All-Father, a complex and often contradictory figure who embodied many aspects of the Viking worldview. Unlike the distant, all-powerful gods of other religions, Odin was deeply involved in the affairs of both gods and mortals. This willingness to cross gender boundaries in pursuit of power and knowledge made him a uniquely compelling figure, a god who would sacrifice anything, even social conventions, to achieve his goals. Born from Loki's shape-changing encounter with a giant stallion, Sleipnir could travel between the 9 worlds with ease. This horse represented the shamanic tradition of spirit journeys, where practitioners would enter trance states to travel to other realms. These weren't mere servants but powerful supernatural beings with their own agency and desires. Valkyries like Brunhild became central figures in their own right, capable of defying even Odin when their sense of justice demanded it. In one famous tale, Thor must disguise himself as the goddess Freya to retrieve his stolen hammer from the giant Thrym. The giants Jotun weren't necessarily evil, but they represented the wild, untamed forces of nature that constantly threatened to overwhelm human civilization. Hammer pendants have been found in graves across Scandinavia, and place names throughout the Nordic countries bear his name. She was also a war goddess who claimed half of those who died in battle, taking them to her hall. She was said to have taught this magic to Odin himself, making her one of the most powerful figures in the pantheon. Her falcon cloak allowed her to fly between the worlds, and she was known for her tears of gold, a reference to her sorrow for her missing husband Thor, whose name was actually another title for Odin. The practice of cider involved entering trance states, communicating with spirits, and seeing possible futures, skills that were both revered and feared in Viking society. He sacrificed his magical sword for the chance to marry the giantess Ger, a decision that would prove costly during Ragnarok. Neither fully god nor giant, Loki was both helper and hindrance to the gods. His ability to cross boundaries between male and female, god and giant, helper and hindrance made him both valuable and dangerous. At its center stood Yggdrasil, the World Tree, an enormous ash that connected 9 different worlds, realm of the giants. Svartalfheim, home of the dark elves or dwarves. Helheim, domain of the dead. Niflheim, the primordial world of ice. And Muspelheim, the realm of fire. Each world had its own characteristics and inhabitants, and travel between them was possible for those with the knowledge and power to do so. This wasn't just a philosophical concept but a living reality for Vikings, who saw the tree's roots, trunk, and branches as the framework upon which all existence depended. An eagle perched in its crown, while the squirrel Ratatoskr ran up and down the trunk, carrying messages between the eagle and the dragon. From the ashes of the old world would emerge a new one, green and fertile, populated by the surviving gods and 2 human beings who had hidden in Yggdrasil during the destruction. This cyclical view of time, where destruction led to renewal, influenced Viking attitudes toward change and conflict. It helped them accept that all things must pass, but also believe that endings could become new beginnings. And made private offerings at household shrines. Many had personal relationships with specific deities. A warrior might be particularly devoted to Odin or Tyr, while a farmer might favor Thor or Freyr. Many Vikings adopted a syncretic approach, worshipping both Norse gods and Christ depending on the situation. Some Vikings converted for political reasons, others were genuinely attracted to Christian teachings, and many simply added Christ to their existing pantheon of protective deities. This wasn't seen as contradictory. Vikings were pragmatic about religion, using whatever spiritual resources seemed most appropriate for their circumstances. For stags browsed among its branches, and the well of fate lay beneath its roots, tended by the 3 Norns who controlled destiny. There was no single church or priesthood, though. Some individuals, called Gor in Iceland, served as both chieftains and priests. The stories were preserved in Iceland, written down by scholars like Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. They faced the same challenges as mortals: betrayal, loss, the inevitability of death. Odin worried about the future, Thor could be tricked by clever enemies, and even the gods couldn't escape their fate. This made Norse mythology deeply human despite its supernatural elements, and helps explain why these ancient stories continue to resonate with modern audiences who find in them reflections of their own struggles, hopes, and fears. These texts, the Prose Edda, the Poetic Edda, and various sagas have kept Norse mythology alive for nearly 1,000 years, continuing to inspire artists, writers, and storytellers today. The most important ceremonies were the sacrificial feasts, where animals and occasionally humans were offered to the gods. These weren't grim affairs but community celebrations that combined religious ritual with social bonding. The sacrificial meat would be cooked and shared among the participants, and the blood would be sprinkled on altars, trees, and people. These religious leaders maintained temples, organized festivals, and performed sacrifices, but they weren't separate from secular society. They were farmers, traders, and warriors who also had religious responsibilities. Adam of Bremen, a medieval chronicling, described it as a magnificent golden temple where sacrifices were held every 9 years. 9 males of every species, including humans, would be hanged from trees in the sacred grove, their bodies left as offerings to the gods. While Adam's account may be exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms that Uppsala was a major religious center for centuries. The myths show a progression in Loki's character, from helpful trickster to malevolent force, culminating in his role in bringing about Ragnarok, born of giant parentage but raised among the Sur he represented. The liminal figure who exists between categories. This apocalyptic vision began with a terrible winter called Fimbulwinter, lasting 3 years without relief. Brothers would fight brothers, moral bonds would dissolve, and the very foundations of society would crumble. Then would come the final battle, where gods and giants would destroy each other in mutual annihilation. But with the giant Asangurbada, he fathered 3 beings who would play crucial roles in Ragnarok: Jormungandr the world serpent, Fenrir the wolf, and Hel, ruler of the dead. Even the gods were subject to their power, for they wove the fates of all beings. This concept of fate word or algorgul was central to Viking thinking. Unlike the Christian concept of divine providence, Norse fate was impersonal and inexorable. Even knowing one's fate in advance couldn't change it, but it could allow one to meet it with courage and dignity. The gods' treatment of these children, binding Fenrir, casting Jormungandr into the sea, and exiling Hel to the underworld, helped ensure their eventual enmity. His cunning often saved the gods from difficult situations. He recovered Thor's hammer, helped build Asgard's wall, and provided the gods with their greatest treasures. This myth reflected Viking understanding that even gods must make difficult choices and live with the consequences. Freyr's Borgulin Bursti could run through air and water faster than any horse and his ship. Blanir could be folded up and carried in a pocket when not in use. This dual nature, love and war, creation and destruction, exemplified the complex nature of Norse deities. In Viking understanding, the same forces that created life also brought death, and the goddess who blessed marriages also decided the fate of warriors. Thursday Thor's Day preserves his memory in our modern calendar. His popularity likely stemmed from his role as protector. While Odin might trick his followers for the greater good, Thor would always defend them. Thor's role as their primary opponent made him the champion of farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary people who struggled daily against the harsh Scandinavian environment. Seeing the mighty Thor dressed as a bride, struggling to maintain feminine mannerisms while barely restraining his violent nature, provided comedy that balanced the more serious aspects of Norse mythology. The concept of the Valkyrie reflected Viking beliefs about women's spiritual power and their role in determining fate. For Vikings, Sleipnir symbolized the ability to transcend normal limitations and access hidden knowledge. In one of the most powerful myths, he hanged himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree, pierced by his own spear. For 9 days and nights to discover the secret of the runes, he presided over Valhalla, the great hall where warriors who died bravely in battle would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. Valhalla itself was described as an enormous hall with 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through side by side. The roof was made of golden shields, and spears served as rafters. Here, the Einherjar, the chosen slain, would feast on mead served by Valkyries and dine on the flesh of the boris, which was slaughtered daily but restored to life each evening. In another tale, he sacrificed his eye to drink from the well of wisdom. This portrayal of a god willing to suffer for knowledge resonated deeply with Vikings, who valued wisdom and cunning as much as physical courage. Where Odin was complex and often treacherous, Thor was straightforward and reliable, the defender of gods and humans against the forces of chaos. His hammer Mjolnir was one of the most potent symbols in Norse culture, forged by the dwarven brothers Eitri and Brokkr in a contest of skill. The hammer never missed its target and always returned to Thor's hand after being thrown. It was capable of leveling mountains and slaying giants, but also of blessing marriages and consecrating births. He was a wanderer who traveled the 9 worlds in search of wisdom, often in disguise as a gray-cloaked traveler with a wide-brimmed hat. He was known by over 200 different names, each reflecting a different aspect of his character. Grimnir the Masked One, Gangleri the Wanderer, Bulverkr the Evildoer, and Gladsheim the Glad Home. This multiplicity of names reflected the Viking understanding that wisdom came in many forms, sometimes pleasant, sometimes terrible. Odin could appear as a benevolent father figure offering advice, or as a terrifying specter bringing doom. His ravens, Hugin and Munin thought and memory, flew across all the worlds each day to bring him information. Odin's pursuit of knowledge was relentless and sometimes self-destructive. But Odin was far more complex than many realize. His role as a shaman god was particularly important to Viking culture. Odin practiced cider magic, traditionally associated with women, which involved trance states, prophecy, and communication with spirits. The 8-legged horse Sleipnir, Odin's mount, deserves special attention as one of the most fascinating creatures in Norse mythology. But Odin was also the god of war and the slain. The Valkyries, warrior maidens who served Odin, would choose which warriors would die in battle and escort the bravest to Valhalla. Thor, Odin's son, represented a different aspect of the divine. The myths surrounding Thor were often humorous as well as heroic. Thor's battles against the giants weren't just cosmic conflicts, they represented the eternal struggle between order and chaos, civilization and wilderness. Archaeological evidence shows that Thor was probably the most popular god among ordinary Vikings. Freya, goddess of love and fertility, represented another crucial aspect of Norse religion. But she was far more than a simple love goddess. Freya was also associated with magic, particularly cider, a form of Norse witchcraft that involved prophecy and manipulation of fate. The goddess traveled in a chariot pulled by 2 cats and owned a magical necklace called, which she obtained through a complex bargain with 4 dwarven craftsmen. Freyr, Freya's brother, was a god of prosperity, fertility, and kingship. The trickster god Loki occupies a unique position in Norse mythology. But Loki's nature was fundamentally chaotic. He was a shapeshifter who could become a mare, a salmon, a fly, or an old woman as circumstances required. Loki's children were equally complex figures. With his wife Sigyn, he had 2 sons, Nari and Vali. The Norse cosmos itself was a magnificent construction that reflected Viking understanding of geography, psychology, and spirituality. The 9 worlds included Asgard, realm of the Sur gods, Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, Alfheim, land of the Light Elves, Midgard, the human world, Jotunheim. Yggdrasil itself was inhabited by various creatures. At its base coiled the dragon, Njini, Hgr, constantly gnawing at the roots. The Nornser past, Verandi present, and Skuld future were among the most important figures in Norse cosmology. This cosmology wasn't static, it was heading toward an inevitable end called Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. But Ragnarök wasn't truly an ending, it was a transformation. Norse religious practices were diverse and decentralized, reflecting the scattered nature of Scandinavian settlements. Religious ceremonies often took place at natural sites, sacred groves, springs, or rock formations. The Great Temple at Old Uppsala in Sweden was the most famous religious site in the Viking world. Personal religious practice was equally important. Vikings wore amulets depicting their favorite gods, carved protective runes on their belongings. The conversion to Christianity was a gradual process that took centuries and varied greatly between regions. The famous hammer cross pendants found in Denmark show Thor's hammer on one side and a Christian cross on the other, symbolizing this religious flexibility. Even after official conversion, Norse mythology continued to influence Scandinavian culture. The Norse gods weren't perfect beings to be worshipped from afar, they were complex characters whose struggles and failures made them relatable to their human followers. The Vikings didn't just create myths about gods, they also created some of the most compelling human stories in world literature. The sagas, written primarily in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries, preserve not only the memory of the Viking Age, and these stories were originally preserved through oral tradition before being committed to writing. What makes the sagas remarkable is their psychological realism. These aren't simple tales of good versus evil, But complex narratives about flawed human beings struggling with questions of honor, family loyalty, love, and revenge that remain relevant today, but also represent one of the first realistic forms of narrative literature in European history. When Volsung's daughter Signy is forced to marry the evil King Siggeir, it sets in motion a chain of events involving murder, revenge, and supernatural intervention. The tale reaches its climax with Sigurd, who reforges his father's broken sword and uses it to slay Fafnir, bathing in the dragon's blood to become invulnerable except for one spot on his back. The word saga comes from the Old Norse segja, meaning to say or to tell. The dragon Fafnir was once a man, corrupted by greed for gold. He kills his first man at age 7, composes his first poem at age 3, and throughout his long life alternates between acts of shocking brutality and moments of tender sensitivity. Egil's grief is so overwhelming that he plans to kill himself, but his daughter Thorgerd challenges him to compose a poem about his loss instead. The resulting poem, Lament for My Son Sonatoric, is one of the most moving expressions of parental grief in world literature. In it, Egil wrestles with his anger at Odin for taking his son, his loss of faith in the gods, and his struggle to find meaning in a world that seems cruel and arbitrary. Her story challenges modern assumptions about gender roles in Viking society, showing that women could be active participants in exploration and warfare, not just passive victims or prizes. In one famous scene, she rallies the Norse defenders against a native attack by baring her breast and slapping it with a sword, shaming the men into fighting harder. This complexity makes him feel remarkably modern, a flawed anti-hero who struggles with his own nature. Her greed for profit leads her to betray and murder her own partners in the Vinland expedition, showing how the same qualities that made Vikings successful explorers could also make them dangerous enemies. Set against the backdrop of Iceland's conversion to Christianity, it explores how personal relationships become entangled with larger historical forces. Gudrun, one of the most complex female characters in medieval literature, must choose between different men who represent different aspects of the changing world around her. The saga doesn't judge her actions simply, it presents her as a complex figure whose strengths and weaknesses are inextricably linked. Egil's grief doesn't disappear, but by creating poetry from his pain, he finds a way to continue living. This theme, the transformative power of art, runs throughout the saga, suggesting that creative expression might be the closest thing to immortality that humans can achieve. This establishes the theme of strong women that runs throughout the saga. Gudrun herself is described as the most beautiful woman in Iceland, but her beauty is both blessing and curse. It attracts admirers but also creates jealousy and conflict. Brunhild is punished by Odin for disobeying his will, trapped in a ring of fire until a hero can wake her. Eric's exile from Iceland for manslaughter leads him to explore and settle Greenland, while his son Eliaif's voyage to Vinland, North America, opens up an entirely new world. She travels farther than any other woman in medieval literature, journeying from Iceland to Greenland to North America and eventually to Rome. She survives shipwrecks, native attacks, and the death of 2 husbands, yet remains a figure of dignity and strength throughout her ordeals. Her story suggests that Viking women could be just as adventurous and resilient as their male counterparts. But the saga is as much about the strong-willed women of Eric's family, his daughter-in-law Gudrid and his daughter Freydis, as it is about exploration. But unlike later courtly romances, the Volsung saga doesn't shy away from the brutal consequences of its characters' actions. Heroes die, families are destroyed, and even the gods themselves are diminished by the unfolding tragedy. When Sigurd rescues her, they pledge eternal love, but political machinations and memory-erasing magic separate them. Egil was both a fierce warrior and a gifted poet, capable of both savage violence and profound emotional depth. The saga follows 3 generations of his family, showing how violence begets violence, but also how art and poetry can provide a path to transcendence. Their eventual reunion leads to a murder plot that destroys both their families. This transformation serves as a warning about the corrupting power of wealth and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The cursed gold that drives the plot represents the double-edged nature of prosperity. It brings power and status, but also jealousy and violence. The oral tradition that preserved these stories was remarkably sophisticated. Professional storytellers called skalds were honored members of Viking society who could recite hundreds of tales from memory. By the 12th century, Iceland had been Christian for over a century, and literacy was spreading among the wealthy. Yet the memory of the pagan past remained vivid, and many Icelanders could trace their ancestry directly back to the first settlers. This created a perfect storm for literary creation: the technical skills to write, the cultural motivation to preserve the past, and enough temporal distance to see the Viking Age with both nostalgia and critical perspective. These weren't mere entertainers but keepers of cultural memory, legal precedent, and social values. The Skalds developed complex poetic forms with intricate rhyme schemes and alliteration that made the stories easier to remember while also creating beautiful musical language. The transition from oral to written tradition occurred during a unique period in Icelandic history. The saga of the Volsungs stands as perhaps the most influential of all Norse stories, serving as the foundation for Wagner's Ring cycle and inspiring countless modern adaptations. This epic tale follows the descendants of Volsung through generations of tragedy and triumph. At its heart is Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, who kills the dragon Fafnir and wins a treasure hoard that brings nothing but sorrow to those who possess it. The story begins with Sigi, a son of Odin, and traces his lineage through his grandson Volsung, who builds a great hall around a mighty oak tree. But the Volsung saga contains layers of meaning that reward careful study. The relationship between Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brunhild is one of the most psychologically complex in all of literature. The saga explores themes that would become central to medieval literature: the conflict between love and duty, the destructive nature of gold and power, and the inevitability of fate. Egil's saga tells the story of Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the most complex characters in medieval literature. The character of Egil himself is fascinating, ugly, unpredictable, and often antisocial, yet capable of creating poetry of remarkable beauty. The most famous episode in Egil's saga occurs when his young son Bodvar dies in an accident. The poem serves as a turning point in the saga, showing how art can transform raw emotion into something beautiful and lasting. The saga of Eric the Red chronicles the Viking discovery of Greenland and North America, blending historical fact with family drama. Gudrid is one of the most remarkable figures in the saga literature. Freydis, in particular, represents a fascinating figure, a woman who participates in the Vinland expedition and shows both remarkable courage and ruthless ambition. But Freydis also represents the darker side of Viking expansion. The Laxdæla saga has been called the most beautiful of all the sagas, focusing on the tragic love triangle between Kjartan, Boli, and Gudrun. The saga begins with the arrival of the deep-minded in Iceland, a woman who leads her own expedition and distributes land to her followers. The popular image of Vikings as savage raiders tells only part of their story. In reality, Viking society was sophisticated, complex, and remarkably progressive in many ways. Honor encompassed a complex web of obligations and relationships that governed everything from business dealings to family interactions. These households were largely self-sufficient, producing their own food, clothing, and tools. The archetypal Viking farm was a collection of buildings arranged around a central longhouse where the family lived, worked, and entertained guests. A person's reputation was their most valuable possession, more important than gold or land, because it determined their place in society and their ability to function within the community. The longhouse at Borg was over 80 meters long and could accommodate 200 people for feasting. The legendary shield maidens may have been rare, but they weren't mythical. Boys and girls learned gender-specific skills from an early age, but both received education in the oral traditions that preserved law, history, and poetry. Fostering sending children to be raised by relatives or allies was common and served to strengthen political and social bonds between families. Grave excavations have uncovered women buried with weapons, and historical sources record specific instances of women leading raids and battles. The most famous is probably Lagertha, a Norwegian ruler who fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, though distinguishing historical fact from legend in such cases can be challenging. Its great hall was decorated with elaborate tapestries and filled with precious objects from across the known world, proof that successful Vikings lived in considerable luxury. They recognized different categories of crime and punishment, provided for compensation rather than revenge in many cases, and included protections for the weak and defenseless. Religious ceremonies often centered around seasonal festivals that combined worship with community celebration. Many Christian Vikings maintained their traditional values of courage, loyalty, and adventure while adopting new beliefs about the afterlife and moral behavior. This synthesis created a distinctive Scandinavian form of Christianity that retained many characteristics of the old culture. Towns like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden became major commercial hubs, attracting merchants from across Europe and beyond. These early cities featured planned layouts, specialized craftsmen's quarters, and sophisticated trade networks that prefigured the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages. The Great, or sacrifice feasts, brought together entire regions for days of ritual, feasting, and social interaction. Many of their innovations in law, governance, trade, and technology were absorbed into medieval European civilization, while their stories and traditions continued to shape Scandinavian identity for centuries to come. The democratic traditions of modern Scandinavia, the region's emphasis on gender equality, and its maritime heritage, all trace their roots back to the Viking Age. Unlike many medieval cultures that were tied to specific locations, Vikings were comfortable with travel and resettlement. This flexibility allowed them to establish successful colonies in vastly different environments, from the Arctic conditions of Greenland to the Mediterranean climate of Sicily. The concept of outlawry banishment from society was considered one of the most severe punishments, demonstrating how much Vikings valued community membership. Viking merchants traveled along established routes that connected Greenland to Constantinople, dealing in everything from walrus ivory to Chinese silk. They established permanent trading posts, developed standardized weights and measures, and even created a form of credit system for long-distance transactions. To understand the true Vikings, we must look beyond the longships and battlefields to examine how they lived, worked, and organized their communities during times of peace. They were renowned metalworkers, creating intricate jewelry using techniques like filigree and granulation that required extraordinary precision. Their wood carving was equally impressive, turning functional objects like cart heads and ship prows into elaborate works of art. Most had separate buildings for different functions: byres for animals, workshops for crafts, storage buildings for food and goods, and bathhouses for hygiene. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 AD, was one of the world's first parliaments, where free men gathered annually to make laws and settle disputes. This system of representative democracy was remarkably advanced for its time and influenced the development of similar institutions throughout Scandinavia. Woolen cloth from Scandinavia was prized throughout Europe for its quality, and wealthy Vikings wore garments decorated with silk threads and precious metals. The famous Osberg tapestries, found in a 9th century ship burial, demonstrate the sophistication of Viking textile arts. They could own property, request divorces, run businesses, and serve as religious leaders. The archaeological record includes numerous examples of wealthy women's graves, complete with sets of keys that symbolize their authority over the household and its resources. The Vikings placed great emphasis on cleanliness, bathing regularly and taking pride in their appearance, a stark contrast to many of their European contemporaries. Viking society was built around the concept of honor, but this wasn't simply about courage in battle. The basic unit of Viking society was the extended family, which included not just blood relatives but also sworn companions, servants, and slaves. Archaeological excavations at sites like Borgen, Norway have revealed the grandeur of elite Viking households. But even ordinary Viking households were comfortable by medieval standards. Viking women enjoyed remarkably high status compared to women in other medieval societies. Some Viking women went even further, becoming warriors themselves. Children in Viking society were valued and well treated, though childhood was shorter than in modern times. The Vikings were master craftsmen whose skills extended far beyond weapon making. Viking artisans also excelled at textile production. Trade was central to Viking society, extending far beyond the raiding that dominates popular imagination. The Vikings were also innovators in governance and law. Viking legal codes were sophisticated and surprisingly humane. Religious practice in Viking society was decentralized and flexible. There was no organized priesthood, though certain individuals served as religious leaders for their communities. The gradual conversion to Christianity didn't eliminate Viking culture; instead, it transformed it. Viking society was also notable for its mobility and adaptability. Perhaps most remarkably, Viking society produced some of the world's first urban centers in Scandinavia. The end of the Viking Age didn't mean the end of Viking culture. As we reach the end of our journey through the Viking Age, it is worth asking, why do these medieval Scandinavians continue to capture our imagination more than 1,000 years after their longships last sailed the seas? The answer lies not just in their dramatic exploits, but in what they represent about human potential and the courage to venture into the unknown. The Vikings were many things: raiders and traders, explorers and settlers, warriors and poets, pagans and Christians. They established the first European settlements in North America, created trade routes that connected continents, founded cities that still thrive today, and developed forms of governance that influenced modern democracy. The Norse myths speak to universal human experiences: the search for meaning, the struggle against overwhelming odds, the bonds of family and friendship, the price of ambition, and the inevitability of change. Recent discoveries have shown that Vikings were more diverse, more peaceful, and more culturally sophisticated than earlier. Generations of historians realized women played larger roles, trade was more important than raiding, and their influence on medieval Europe was more profound and positive than previously understood. These stories have been retold and reimagined countless times, from Wagner's operas to Marvel's movies, because they contain truths about the human condition that transcend time and culture. Countries like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden consistently rank among the world's happiest and most prosperous nations, and many of their distinctive characteristics — gender equality, democratic governance, environmental stewardship, and international cooperation — can trace their roots back to values and institutions that emerged during the Viking Age. But their spirit, that restless, questing energy that drove them to sail beyond the edge of the known world, lives on. And somewhere in the mists of time, the ghosts of those first bold sailors who left the safety of familiar shores to discover what lay beyond the horizon would surely approve. They understood something that we sometimes forget in our comfortable modern world: that the greatest adventures begin when we push off from the dock and set sail for unknown waters, guided only by the stars and our own courage. It lives on in every explorer who ventures into the unknown, every immigrant who seeks a better life in a foreign land, every entrepreneur who builds something new from nothing, and every storyteller who keeps alive the tales that define who we are. They show us that civilizations can reinvent themselves, that cultural exchange enriches rather than diminishes us, and that the willingness to venture into unknown waters is essential for progress. But the reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they refuse to accept limits and dare to dream beyond the horizon. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson the Vikings have to teach us: that the greatest journeys begin not with a destination in mind, but with the simple courage to leave the shore behind and sail toward whatever wonders await beyond the edge of the world. In a world that often seems to value security over adventure and conformity over courage, the Vikings call us to remember what we are capable of when we are willing to risk everything for the chance to discover something new. They introduced new technologies, spread ideas across vast distances, and served as a bridge between different cultures and civilizations. Instead, they left us something perhaps more valuable: the example of a people who dared to believe that the world was larger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined, and who had the courage to go out and prove it. Their sagas and myths have survived for a millennium because they were preserved by people who understood that stories shape identity and that the past informs the present. In our digital age, when information is abundant but wisdom is scarce, the Viking tradition of preserving and sharing meaningful narratives offers valuable lessons about what truly matters. In an age of global connectivity and rapid change, the Viking willingness to adapt, explore, and reinvent themselves seems remarkably contemporary. They remind us that uncertainty can be opportunity, that the greatest rewards often require the greatest risks, and that the only way to discover what lies beyond the horizon is to sail toward it. But above all, they were boundary crossers, people who refused to accept that the world beyond the horizon was unknowable or unreachable. In an age when most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, Vikings traveled thousands of miles to establish settlements in places their grandparents had never imagined. Their impact on world history was profound and lasting. But perhaps more importantly, they created a cultural legacy that continues to inspire us. The Viking approach to life, embracing adventure, valuing honor over comfort, facing the unknown with courage rather than fear, resonates powerfully in our modern world. The archaeological record continues to reveal new aspects of Viking civilization, forcing us to revise our understanding of these remarkable people. Modern Scandinavia has embraced its Viking heritage while recognizing the complexity of that legacy. The Vikings also remind us of the power of storytelling. As we face our own uncertain future with challenges like climate change, technological disruption, and global inequality, the Viking example suggests that human adaptability and courage are our greatest assets. The Vikings didn't leave behind massive stone monuments like the Egyptians or complex philosophical systems like the Greeks. Their longships no longer cut through northern seas, their gods no longer walk among mortals, and their great halls have long since crumbled into dust. The Viking Age may have ended 1,000 years ago, but the age of human exploration and adventure continues. This is the true legacy of the Vikings, not just the lands they conquered or the stories they told. The dragon-headed ships may be gone, but the spirit that built them sails on in every human heart, brave enough to answer the call of the unknown.